most of the early immigrants or colonizers to Liberia were free blacks, mostly from the north and from the Chesapeake. And they volunteered. And they usually had their way paid for by the American-Colonization Society, which engaged in a massive fundraising drive among, mostly in churches, evangelical churches, both in the north and in the Chesapeake region of the south. So most of the early settlers were free blacks. Many of them were mulattoes. Many of them were mixed race people. Many of them were literate. These were, from well-off families. So why would they leave? They left for a few reasons. One reason, and the most prominent reason, I think, was just life was miserable if you were a free black in America in the early 19th century. You were treated as a second-class citizen. You had no rights. You were offered no dignity, no self-respect in this country. It was an incredibly racist republic. These people were feared, they were despised, even in the north, even in northern cities. Many of them had trades. Some of them were small-time businessmen, and they saw the opportunity to make money in Liberia. There's a lot of goods coming out of the forests of Liberia. Camwood, which was an early form of red dye before the invention of chemical dyes, was a big export. Ivory, other African export crops. So business was the second motivation, right, for some of these people. The third motivation was that many of them were evangelicals themselves and believed that Africans needed the word of God brought to them. They needed the message of eternal salvation and Christianity, and so some of them went for the purposes of liberating their fellow Africans, the people who they saw as their ancestors, from the darkness of paganism. So they were evangelicals as well. So there were, and some of them, of course, inevitably had mixed motives. They were motivated by Christianity, by business interests, and just to be free of slavery.
The colonial settler effect, that gave total authority to Americo-Liberians, gave them a strong foundation to rule the country. While in Sierra Leone, the Creoles didn't have that privilege. To look at the power they have, in Sierra Leone, the British were still in control despite the presence of the Creoles, who were well educated. If to compare them to the Americo-Liberians in Liberia, they were relatively well educated. They had total control over the exercise of authority on the native and the land. Now they control or possess.
And many of them died, but those who survived were able to prosper somewhat and gradually establish themselves both in Monrovia and in some of the upriver agricultural communities of Liberia, and they began to, their settlements took hold in Africa, in Liberia, and they began to prosper after a fashion. They began to do better economically, and they began to push a little bit more against the agents for more autonomy and more control over their own lives. The colonists controlled Cape Mesurado, where Monrovia is. They controlled some of the upriver communities along the St. Paul's River Valley, and they spread a little bit along the coast. But for the reality of the situation was the vast hinterland. It really took about 100 years for the Liberian government to finally exert its control over its territory. And the other thing that should be mentioned was the territory of Liberia initially, in the 19th century, was much larger than it is today, probably 3 times as large. They claimed large sections of Guinea, large sections of Sierra Leone, large sections of Cote d'Ivoire, the countries that surround it today. But the French and the British, used their greater power to slice away chunks of Liberia over the 19th century, until Liberia was shrunk to about 1/3 of its size, and to the size that we see it today on maps.
League of Nations criticized the Liberian government for abusing native Liberians. This is the first challenge to a first Black Republic of Africa.
What happened was the Spanish had small colonies in what is now Equatorial Guinea. I believe the island was called Fernando Po. It's now known as Bioko. And these were cocoa plantations. And they were in great need of labor. The native population of these islands either refused to do the work or had died out because of diseases. And so there was an arrangement made with the Liberian government to bring over native laborers from Liberia to work on these cocoa islands. The arrangement was that these cocoa planters would commission with the Liberian government, who would then commission with local chiefs to round up likely young men. The chiefs would be paid, the Liberian government officials would be paid, and the laborers were supposed to be paid once their contract was up. These were for 2-3-year contracts. But what happened was that when the laborers went over there, many of them died before their term was up because conditions were so god-awful in these cocoa plantations. Food was scarce, disease was prevalent, these people were overworked, and many of them died. And when they came back to Liberia, many of them had their money that was supposedly held in trust for them by Liberian officials and by the chiefs was kept from them. And the conditions were so awful on these cocoa islands, and these men were not really volunteers. They had been sort of forced to go by Liberian officials and by these cooperative chiefs who were basically worked for the Liberian government, that it began to smell of a slave trade. So the League of Nations began to investigate. This was, of course, the predecessor organization of the United Nations. And the League of Nations investigated, and they sent over some commissioners to look into it. One was Liberian, one was a Black American journalist named Charles Johnson, and the third was a British colonial official from West Africa. And they went around and they interviewed. They went from village to village in Liberia. They went into Monrovia and they held hearings, and they brought people forward who had been exploited in this trade, and heard horrendous testimony, just awful conditions of being forced to work on these cocoa plantations, that it not being a choice. And the League of Nations came to the conclusion at that point, the Commission came to the conclusion that while it wasn't exactly slavery in the old sense of the word, this was close enough that it should be banned. There was a certain amount of hypocrisy in the League of Nations approach, because this kind of activity was going on all over Africa. The British did the same in their holdings. The French did the same in their holdings. That is, worked with chiefs to almost forcibly remove young men to work on these plantations, in whether they're palm oil plantations, rubber plantations, whatever they were. This was going all over Africa when it was under European colonial rule. So there was a certain amount of hypocrisy. The other hypocrisy in this was that the Spanish planters were never indicted or never put under the microscope of this investigation. And in fact, they were the ones who had called for the labor in the first place. And they were the ones who were abusing these workers. But they never got put in the dock by the League of Nations. What happened in Liberia was that the scandal was so troubling to them. And once again, there was talk that Liberia needed to have white control. There had always been talk that Liberia should be put under white control, a mandate, like the League of Nations mandates in the Middle East. That the Americo-Liberians were not capable of self-government. And here was an example of it. They were enslaving their own people. The Liberian diplomats were able to ward off this threat to their sovereignty. And that was, above all else, their sovereignty was precious to them. And they were able to ward it off, but it did cost the president of Liberia his position. He was forced to resign, even though he was not involved in the trade. And the vice president, who was very much involved in the trade, ended up having to flee the country or face serious jail time.
But in Sierra Leone, before independence, the Creoles still had some kind of dependency, on the British. The British controlled basically their life, their economic, social, political lives. So when we talk about power leading to independence, the British, at the end of the day, the British were already educating the natives in the interior after high school, because some of them went to government schools in the interior of the country. They would take them straight to England, where they went to universities, and a lot of them became doctors. And to point to that reality, the first Prime Minister of Sierra Leone, Samuel Timangai, had his education in England, just from high school straight to England. So on the day of independence, at the convention, the Creoles thought, we're going to be the only educated people, at the convention that will ask for leadership. And to their surprise, there were a lot of natives who already have doctoral degrees, who were, educationally very sound to compete with them, and to add more salt to the injury, they had more population to support them, because the Creoles are still considered in Sierra Leone as a minority.
Les réfugiés Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone is made up of a number of different tribal identities, and most of the time they worked together quite well, and sometimes worked very well together when fighting opposition, like the Portuguese, who came in the 1600s, and the British, who were going to come in the 1800s. So after the Portuguese abandoned trying to colonize Sierra Leone, Britain came in about 200 years later in the 1800s, and one of the first things they started to do was just tax everything. And this would lead to the Hut Tax War of 1898. The Hut Tax War was led by Bai Bure, and I wanted to bring him up because he still remains one of the national heroes of Sierra Leone. He was really effective in organizing the different tribes to fight against the British, but the battle only lasted about 6 months until finally he was arrested, and the British used him as a transition in order to get the workers to build roads and the infrastructure for the British settlement. He's considered a national hero for Sierra Leone, and he also served as a really interesting strategic move by the British, because they were able to use one of the Sierra Leoneans to help organize and have the Sierra Leoneans follow his orders. And now Sierra Leone has been a British protectorate now for a little over 60 years, and Britain is ready to give this country their independence. To commemorate the occasion, the Queen Mother herself rode on a huge British naval ship all the way to the coast of Africa at the young age of 34. Here's a pretty cool comparison between her over the course of 60 years. So while everything looks like a big party, there was a lot of negotiations that happened in establishing the new constitution for Sierra Leone. In those discussions, Sir Milton Margai was the person who was selected to be the Prime Minister of Sierra Leone by the Queen herself. One of the reasons why Milton Margai was probably selected was because in the negotiations, there remained this understanding that Britain would still be able to keep their companies and use the resources of Sierra Leone. Now, that was something that Siaka Stevens, another political leader, had absolutely refused to cooperate with. Milton Margai distanced himself from Siaka Stevens, rightfully so, because Siaka felt that Margai had sold out Sierra Leone. Here was this situation where they were supposed to rule their own country, but they weren't allowed to own any of the resources in their country. And this is going to be something that divides the rest of the Sierra Leonean population for years to come.
Brought me to a place of honor. I say, are you Papa? Jesus, are you make my life better, 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 better.
going to start getting into some of the corruption of politics that happened after England starts to distance herself from Sierra Leone. One of the first things that we notice is that Sir Milton Margai dies, and he ends up appointing his brother into office, which is total nepotism, and it really starts to upset the Sierra Leonean people. Now, one of the good parts about having British rule was that you had British protection and British schools and roads, and you had money, and they end up voting in Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister in 1967. When Siaka Stevens first came into office, he was considered this great hope. He promised to remove other companies, outside companies, from sucking out the resources of Sierra Leonean soil, and he promised to stop corruption. Unfortunately, Siaka Stevens is par for the course for most African leaders who tried to take over after some sort of colonial independence day, where corruption quickly followed, and there was infrastructure failure, economic failure, oppositional resistance. I mean, it was really a difficult uphill battle. Siaka Stevens rewrites the Constitution. He makes himself president. He publicly assassinates about 14 of his closest advisors. He creates martial law. Oh, it looks like a dictatorship. And now that British is no longer really feeding money into those programs, the whole country has gone downhill economically. There's virtually no education system. But what does Siaka Stevens spend his money on? Building a gigantic soccer stadium, which was created in 1979. Siaka Stevens' entire presidency was pretty much shaped by corruption. He used Sierra Leone as his personal piggy bank. He looted, and anybody who turned him in or even voiced what he was really doing was assassinated and killed. He outlawed all other political parties, and it was very difficult to remove him from office, which is why nobody did.
Following the Guinea invasion, Parliament passed a resolution here to say that we should make a defense pact with Guinea and Liberia. We are a small nation here, we don't have much, and we could take some comfort in linking up with these people in matters of defense, so that if anything happened to us, they could come to our help. We had reached agreement with Guinea, and the president of Liberia said he was looking into the matter. So when this trouble arose, tension in the land, the army divided, everybody's nerve on edge, people couldn't sleep for 2 or 3 days. I thought the best course to take was to implement this agreement, this resolution which Parliament had passed in December 1970. I managed to meet President Sekou Touré, and he readily came to our rescue by agreeing to send soldiers over here. The soldiers arrived here on Sunday morning, and since then there has been some amount of quiet in the place. And I can only hope now that we'll be able to solve these difficulties, so that people may be able to live in peace again.
When Siaka Stevens finally decided to step down, he appointed a man by the name of Momo to take over Sierra Leone as president. Momo was a member of the All People's Congress. Momo was virtually ineffective and incredibly weak.
On March 23, 1991, the Sierra Leonean group, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, led by Fode Senko and backed by Charles Taylor, launched its first attacks in villages of the Kailahun district in a diamond-rich eastern province of Sierra Leone. It was the beginning of more than 10 years of the bloodiest civil war in West Africa history. About 70,000 people were killed in Sierra Leone. 200,000 lost their lives in Liberia, displacing millions of people. The RUF, Sierra Leonean rebel group, became notorious for brutal practices such as mass rapes, amputations, and enrolling children as soldiers.
We fought, people shed their blood to bring genuine change, to have leadership in this country. The economy has been in the hands of who? Foreigners. While our people become slaves, they become beggars.
Taylor had connections with the RUF because when Taylor was fighting his civil war against Doe, he used Sierra Leoneans in his ranks. He had connections with them that went back to the fight against Doe in the 90s, when the RUF was starting its fight against the government in Freetown. So he had a lot of connections between the two. But what he saw in Sierra Leone once he took power, because the civil war continued in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has a lot of diamonds. And he saw the ability to trade weapons with the RUF, to provide them weapons. In exchange, the RUF, which controlled a lot of the mines in eastern Sierra Leone where the diamonds were, that they would trade diamonds for weapons. And Taylor would then take those diamonds and make himself rich, and there was a lot of profit to be made. So Taylor supported the RUF mostly to get the diamonds of Sierra Leone.
Momo was virtually ineffective and incredibly weak, and he would be taken out by the name of Valentine Strasser. He's young. He's only 25 years old in this picture, and he would be the youngest president of an African country in history. Unfortunately, when he took office, he sought out revenge on any of his oppositional leaders, kind of continuing this bloodbath of a cycle that happened every time a leader took over, taking out the people that opposed him in the past. This left a lot of bad blood and a lot of reason for revenge.
The government people, even Britain is arming now the government to teeth. And who say disarm, they're arming them. You have government troops, you have Kamajos, you have Bintis, you have the former SLA who joined us in the bush. All of them are armed.
This is where the story gets a little bit messy, because the war in Sierra Leone coincides with the war in next-door neighbor Liberia. Samuel Doe was the leader of Liberia, and the United States had a relationship with the country up until they learned that he had conducted horrible crimes and corruption and murdered many of his people. Enter Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is probably one of the most notorious figures in the 20th century, and this is where his story begins. He was a young Liberian, and he wanted to take Samuel Doe out of his presidency. And he tried a couple times. He later was arrested in the United States for different crimes. He escaped jail and returned back to Africa. But he didn't quite go back to Liberia directly. Charles Taylor stopped in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Muammar Gaddafi had been the leader of Libya for years and years and years, and most of his reign was marked by hating the United States, housing terrorist organizations, moving illegal weapons. He just generally wasn't a very great guy. After spending time in Libya, Charles Taylor felt quite confident that he was ready to evoke a revolution in Liberia. But he knew he couldn't do that unless he had weapons. And you can't get weapons without money. And you can't get money unless you know people. Luckily for Charles Taylor, he had a connection with Foday Sankoh, who he sought out because he understood that Sankoh also wanted to create his own revolution and take over the corrupt government. If Sankoh could help him get access to the Sierra Leonean mines, then Charles Taylor could do business with Victor Bout, a Russian black market arms dealer. Victor Bout is famous for doing business with some of the worst terrorist organizations in the world, including the Taliban and Colombian terrorist group FARC. Foday Sankoh and Charles Taylor agreed to help each other, take over each other's governments, use the diamond mines, access the military weapons, and together take over as presidents of their own countries. Charles Taylor's strategy works out quite well for the Liberian revolutionists. Samuel Doe fell for a trap, and his entire team of guards were assassinated, and he was led to a horrible death in Monrovia, Libya, and died at the age of 39. Promising the end of civil war and a newfound Liberian peace, Charles Taylor won in a landslide election. Meanwhile, back in Sierra Leone, Foday Sankoh's weapons are now in the hands of the RUF soldiers, who, by the way, are the average age of 16. So these children are orphans, they've lost their families, and they are fueled by methamphetamines. They're indoctrinated by ideas to seek revenge on the people who have hurt them. This book really demonstrates that there are no good sides to any part of war. Nobody is innocent. Both of the opposition groups used similar tactics, strategies, forms of torture, and both of them left a lasting imprint on so many children of this generation. And during the Civil War, there was a change of presidents and leadership.
We have been informed about the exaggerated reporting on the levels of fighting going on in the south of Sierra Leone between the local civil defense forces, the Kamajors, and the National Army. The situation is very unfortunate because we thought by now we should all be working as true Sierra Leoneans towards consolidating peace within our country. Sadly, both the external and internal reporting about the ongoing fighting in the south, which is mostly exaggerated. Since we are not at war with Nigeria, we consider their action as an illegal occupation. We will very much appreciate it if they will move back to the area previously allocated to them for the ECOMOG operation in Liberia. We will like the international community to prevail upon them to take the commercial area of the airport so that they can be operational again, so as to allow international flights to resume.
In the Sierra Leonean efforts, or in the ECOWAS efforts, there were, succeeded number of commanders, of which 99.9% were Nigerians, and the most notables among them, General Aquino. And then, of course, General Quino was Ghanaian. And then we have General Joshua, they call him, Joshua Dogoyara. And his work had a lot of impact in the cause of the change in leadership in Liberia. And moving forward, ECOMOG became a force that was met with a lot of controversial, understanding, because West Africa, we have British West Africa and we have, French West Africa. So there was not a complete agreement among these different colonial, background or independent West Africa. So the French West Africa, or the French-speaking countries in West Africa, felt like they were left behind, or they were not properly involved into the creation of the leadership. They felt like the British West Africa, took over the formation of the leadership, which apparently in some levels, in some quarters, they were right, because if you look at the whole ECOMOG leadership was majority of leaders were from Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the Anglophone countries. Due to such understanding between them, there are some scholars that really came out to explain it. A scholar like Adebayo in 2002, confirmed that the legal existence of ECOMOG is illegal. There's no room for ECOWAS to take the mandate, in their exercise of power. There were other reasons, that civilians were very, very concerned about. Like, in the initial stage of their intervention, especially in MONROVIA, especially in Liberia, there were a lot of ECOMOG troops that were involved into some kind of looting. Some of them, had genuine intention, to participate or to help in the effort. But, that kind of gave the populations some kind of uneasiness. How can a force that has come to liberate us now is trying to plunder our resources that we have on the ground? And but also, overall, there was a great deal of recognition for their effort, because everybody were looking towards the West. When will the West come and help us? Because at this time, America has already extracted, America and most Western states or Western countries have already extracted their own citizens, from the region. So it was only under the leadership of, ECOMOG that the Africans or the people of West Africa felt like, oh, at least there's somebody watching out for us. So we can say it was a mixed feeling, But I think the good outweighed the bad feelings against the force.
When do you intend to hold democratic elections?
This will be more dependent on the outcome of our dialogue with the international community and the peaceful situation in our country.
And it wouldn't be until we had international outside involvement that there would come a peace to the Sierra Leonean government.
It's too awful, in a word. It's just too awful. I mean, here are these people who went through a decade of civil war, and while Guinea escaped the worst of the civil war, some of its border regions were impacted. And of course, Guinea suffered from the civil war in other ways because, you know, many people of Guinea are related to people in Liberia and Sierra Leone. So they had family that they knew were suffering. Guinea had an enormous refugee problem. But Sierra Leone and Liberia in particular suffered immensely in these civil wars. They were just horrendous. And then for them to finally achieve peace, and we're achieving a certain modicum of recovery, economic recovery. Kids were going back to school again. You know, the country under Johnson Sirleaf seemed to be beginning. It had some of the highest growth rates in the world. Of course, it was starting at a very low base. Sierra Leone too was really emerging and rebuilding after its civil war. There was great hope, and then to be hit by this horrible disease is just too awful. I mean, I'm not a epidemiologist. I don't understand the biology of it, but I think there is a connection. And it's only been hinted about, and I may be wrong about this. But the fact that these wars displace so many people, push so many people into the bush, what that does when you do that is you increase the contact between the peoples of these countries, and you bring them increasingly into contact. Oh, and also as they go into the forests, they start to hunt for bush game because they have no other source of food. They start hunting for monkeys and chimpanzees to eat because there's no other food for them. And when you get that intersection, and we know that my understanding of Ebola is it lies latent. It's a disease that goes back and forth among primates. Of course, human beings are primate. And that by pushing so many people into the bush, by creating these crises in these countries, where people were so desperate they were forced into the bush and into the jungle and forced to hunt primate as game to eat, that there may have been a role in the spread of Ebola latent in the primate population into the human population. But again, that's speculative. I'm only saying it based on what I read in the press. And I think even epidemiologists and people who study this stuff for a living are not sure, but it's a theory.